John Miller. 68, lived alone in the quiet town of Brattleboro, Vermont. After his wife passed, he left the city for the peace of a small town. At first, solitude felt like freedom. No schedules but his own, no one to answer to. But over time he began to sense the quiet had a hidden cost. His mornings were always the same. Coffee, a slice of dry toast, the TV humming in the background from the moment he woke up. The days bled together until he couldn't remember the last time he'd looked forward to anything. One crisp autumn morning, at the little cafe on Main Street, John ran into Martha, an old college friend now retired from teaching. She spoke about friends of hers who lived alone, yet kept their lives full of activity and joy. Her stories stirred something in him. He thought of Carl, his old neighbor in Boston, who'd fallen into the habit of eating cold soup straight from the can, telling himself it did the job. Carl's life had shrunk without him noticing, and John feared the same could happen to him. That evening, instead of microwaving leftovers, John made a deliberate choice. He cooked spaghetti with garlic bread, set the table with a real plate, lit a candle, and put on a Miles Davis record. Halfway through the meal, he laughed at himself for putting on a show for no one, but he also felt something he hadn't in a long time: anticipation, care, joy. While rinsing the dishes later, he thought, maybe this is where it starts. Maybe I can make living alone feel like living again. He remembered a stretch last winter when a snowstorm kept him indoors for days. The TV never went off, and by the third day, he hadn't stepped outside or spoken to a single soul. It was easy, dangerously easy, to let the voices on the screen replace real conversation. The problem was, those voices never asked him to think move. One afternoon, Martha called and invited him to a free watercolor workshop at the community center. "I don't paint," he'd said instinctively. "You don't watch watercolor on TV either." That evening, after 2 hours of awkward brushstrokes and unexpected laughter, John returned home to a silent living room. For the first time in months, he didn't reach for the remote. Instead, he made tea, replaying in his mind the moment an elderly man named Henry accidentally splattered blue paint across the table and everyone roared with laughter. The silence felt different now, not empty, but earned. He realized the television could be an event, not a constant companion. And maybe if he treated it that way, there would be more space for these unscripted, messy human moments to sneak in. He thought of Mrs. Doy, an elderly neighbor from his Boston days, who had once confessed she hadn't stepped outside for months after her husband died. "One day I opened the door just to air the place out," she'd told him. "I ended up standing barefoot on the porch, and a kid rode by on his bike and waved. That wave, it reminded me I was still." John took a breath, turned the knob, and stepped outside. The morning air was sharp, but refreshing, the street alive with the faint hum of life cars in the distance, a dog barking, the smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakery down the block. A woman he'd seen 100 times, but never spoken to, was tending her garden across the street. She looked up, smiled, and said, "Morning." The greeting caught him off guard. He lifted his coffee in return and felt something loosen in his chest. He didn't need to go far. Even standing in the doorway connected him to something bigger than his. The next day, he made a habit of it, sometimes stepping onto the porch, sometimes just leaning in the doorway. Each time it felt less like opening a door and more like open. John almost refused. Thoughts raced through his head. What if I tip over? What if I'm the slowest one there? What if they all think I'm ridiculous? But he remembered something Eugene, a fellow veteran from Vermont, once told him. At our age, you're old enough not to care what. So on Saturday morning, John found himself standing on the edge of the lake, life jacket, snug paddle in hand. The first few minutes were a comedy of errors. His paddle splashed more water onto himself than into the lake, and his kayak seemed determined to spin in circles. But gradually, he found a rhythm. The water shimmered under the sunlight, loons called in the distance, and the mountains reft. Halfway across the lake, Martha paddled alongside him. "Still think you're too old?" John smiled, breathless but exhilarated. Too old to sigh. By the time they reached shore, he was soaked sore and grinning like a kid. It struck him that the real risk hadn't been. Anh nghĩ đến người hàng xóm cũ ở Boston, người cũng từng làm điều tương tự. Bà đã biến phòng ngủ thành cả vũ trụ của riêng mình để phòng khách phụ bụi, và bạn ăn chìm trong đồng thư chưa mở. Chỉ là dễ hơn thôi, bà từng nói với anh. Nhưng dễ hơn, vậy nên John đã tự thỏa thuận với chính mình. Sáng nào cũng vào bếp với tách cà phê bên cửa sổ đọc sách, trên ghế bành phòng khách tối nào cũng ngồi ăn ở bàn ăn. Tối đầu tiên, anh nấu một món hầm đơn giản rồi bưng ra bàn. Anh thắp thêm một ngọn nến nữa, cây nến này ở giữa phòng. Và lần đầu tiên, sau nhiều năm phòng ăn, bỗng trở nên ấm áp. Sau đó anh chuyển cho đọc sách sang góc phòng khách, ngập nặng nơi anh có thể ngắm nhìn ánh nắng chiều tà tràn xuống sàn nhà. Chủ nhật anh thậm chí còn lau dọn phòng khách và đặt một bàn làm việc nhỏ. Nhiều tuần trôi qua, ngôi nhà của anh bắt đầu giống một nơi để sống hơn là một nơi để ngủ. Every room has a little something. John had learned the truth one summer when a blackout sent him to Mr. Howard's door. The old man had opened it in a bathrobe, flashlight in hand, surprised to see a visitor. "You're the first person to knock in years," he'd said quietly. That confession, now in the Vermont darkness, he wondered if any of his current neighbors might feel the same way. So he grabbed his umbrella and walked across the street to check on Mrs. Parker, the woman who tended her garden every morning. She welcomed him in with a grateful smile, and soon they were sipping tea by candlelight, swapping stories as the storm passed. The next day, when he stepped onto his porch, the greetings came more easily. A nod to the mailman, a wave to the teenager walking his dog. It wasn't about becoming best friends with everyone. It was about being seen, reminding people that he existed. John realized that visibility wasn't just for others' comfort. It was for his own, too. Each small acknowledgement from the world out. He remembered Clarence, an 82-year-old he'd met at the community center, who had taken up French just to surprise his daughter-in-law at Christmas. Clarence hadn't gotten every word right, but the joy in his eyes said more than perfect grammar ever could. And there was Eileen, who at 77 had discovered digital art on an iPad, saying it felt like getting a brand new box of Cray. Those stories echoed in John's mind as he opened the mail that morning and found a flyer for a local photography club. A year ago, he would have tossed it aside without a thought. This time, he pinned it to the corkboard above his. He'd learned that growth didn't have to mean grand adventures or impossible goals. Sometimes it was just saying yes to something small, a walk down a different street, a new recipe, an unfamiliar hobby. The trick was to keep the door open, both literally and figuratively. As the sunlight shifted through the kitchen window, John smiled. Living alone no longer felt like shrinking into the background. It felt like standing at the start of another chapter, pen in hand, read,